Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome this afternoon to this webinar on the future of Finnish gambling regulation. My name is Joe Ewins. I'm the Global Managing Editor at Fixio Gambling Compliance. If you're not familiar with us, we're an independent business information service covering gambling regulation around the world. I'm very, very happy to be here to moderate this EGBA panel. So we're going to talk about the future of gambling regulation in Finland. It's a topic of very intense debate within the country at the moment, and of course much of that debate focuses around the state-owned monopoly operator Veikkaus. And we are going to talk about Veikkaus and how its present and future will impact Finnish gambling regulation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I wanted to set the scene to say that the purpose of our discussion is more to focus on the philosophical, if you like, question of whether the monopoly model is the right path for Finland to stay on in the future, rather than delving into the specific ins and outs of Veikkaus's current operations, although we will touch on what's going on. Although I'm sure those of you joining us from Finland have already heard lots and lots about that in the past few months. So we're going to kind of think about the big picture here, and hopefully that will be useful for you. I've got a wonderful panel of speakers, which I will introduce to you very quickly. Birgitte Sand is here from Birgitte Sand and Associates, also formerly the director of the Danish Gambling Authority, now a consultant advising companies and governments on gambling regulations, but vitally for our discussion was at the head of the Danish regulator when the country liberalized its own gambling model, and we'll have lots of useful experiences to share from that. We also have Rolf Sims, the public affairs manager for the Nordics at the Kindred Group, the online gambling operator, but he was also closely involved in gambling regulation previously with Norsk Tipping and the Norwegian Gambling Authority, as a former director of the board of the Gambling Regulators Europe Forum. Norway, interestingly, is one of the few countries, not in the EU, but European countries to still have its a state-run gambling market. So there'll be some interesting parallels to be drawn there, and also Rolf is now a passionate advocate for a more open licensing system around the world. We also have Jari Vainen, who's the co-founder of the Finnish Gambling Consultants, although he spent a lot of his career at Veikkaus, which is obviously very relevant for this conversation. Much of that time as a senior exec. He's also so founder and partner, as I said, at Finnish Gambling Consultants, which you can probably guess from the name what they do, but for the sake of clarity, it involves advising gambling operators and tech suppliers in the industry. And of course, as a Finn himself, is very close to what's going on in the current debate. Before we get into our conversation, we're also very lucky to be able to hear from Ed Birkin, who's a senior consultant at H2 Gambling Capital, experienced gambling analyst. Many of you will be familiar with the data they put out on the gambling market, and that's certain to be very interesting. Before I hand over to Ed, I will just very quickly say that the EGBA did invite a representative of Veikkaus to take part, but they declined, which is pretty understandable given the very tense political situation around gambling in Finland at the moment, with legislative changes very much on the horizon. Anything they say in public would be very closely watched, but it's that kind of moment of peak interest in Finnish gambling regulation that makes this a very good time to have the debate on whether Finland should consider a more open approach in the future or not. And we're very lucky to have Jari with us as well, who, although he has his own views about Finnish gambling regulation, which you will certainly hear about, his previous experience means he can give us a bit of the perspective of what the monopoly operator is thinking. But we will get into all of that good stuff very shortly. For now, I'm going to hand over to Ed.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think most people, when it comes to data and the panel, will also say that the panel's the good stuff, and before we have the data. So I'll try and keep it pretty short, but hopefully it can set the scene a little bit, a bit wider context for those who aren't as familiar with the gambling market in Finland. So first of all, who are we? H2 Gambling Capital. We're a leading gambling research firm. We predominantly have a subscription service which tracks every single product across different verticals, so online, land-based, across all different countries, states throughout the world. We also have a market share / company section where we track some gambling companies, and have a premium section where we do bespoke research for regulators, suppliers, operators, investors, etc. We have I suppose our users are a broad base across sell side, buy side investors, regulators themselves, operators themselves, etc. as well as other consultant groups. So we're used by a lot of the press. So we've been going about 25 years, and we are probably the most quoted company for gambling intelligence data globally. So hopefully the data we provide today, you have a bit of confidence that it's pretty accurate. Looking to the European market. So the European market has been growing on a pretty steady upward trajectory until the impacts of COVID-19 in 2020. So in 2020, the market was at 65.3 billion euros. Now, I'll just quickly explain a little bit of terminology. So the two main I suppose terms that will metric be used to look at the gambling market is the amount that is actually wagered by a player. So if we're thinking of going into a betting shop, the amount you actually bet, or if you're playing on gaming machines, the amount you actually put coins you put in the gaming machine. And the gross gambling revenue, or GGR, as it may be called on here, that's the amount kept by the operator. So that is the amount that is wagered, the turnover of the player, less the winnings back. So it's really the amount that's spent, because if you keep playing, red and black on roulette over a number of times, you'll just be cycling your own funds. So it's the amount that is left the pocket of the consumer, of the player at the end of the day. So for Europe as a whole, that's gone from 76.7 billion euros in 2016. This is across all gambling, so includes lottery, and it's dropped down to 65, and it's forecast to recover to 88 billion by 2022. Now we split here the retail, online onshore and online offshore. Retail is quite explanatory, that's land-based gambling. Online onshore is where it is online gambling, which onshore means the operator is locally licensed within that country, be it through a monopoly or be it through a local licensing regime. And offshore is something which is declining, and that's where an operator will be licensed in a market such as Malta or Curacao or somewhere else, and will accept bets from players in another country, but they are not necessarily licensed in the same country as the player is in. And when we look at the monopoly versus competitive market, we'll look at the difference between the onshore and the offshore market, where a player in Finland, for instance, is either playing with a locally licensed, i.e. Vikhouse, or they're playing with an offshore company, so a company that is licensed in Gibraltar, but is accepting the bets of a player in Finland or elsewhere. So in terms of the main drivers over this 6-year period, and the reason we've gone to 2022 is really to give a clearer understanding, because 2020 and 2021 are so impacted by lockdowns and closures of land-based gambling facilities. The average growth rate over this 6-year period for the market is 2%. However, the land-based market is declining by 1% a year. The online onshore, as more markets have regulated and encouraged operators to become locally licensed, they've grown by over 20% compound average growth rate per year, and the online offshore has grown slightly at 2%. And therefore, by 2022, we believe that the retail market will account for about 70% of total gross win across Europe, and that was up at 85% in 2016. If we look next at the Finnish market in particular, so what we saw there, whereas the European market was increasing every year up until 2019, the Finnish market has actually started to go into decline before the lockdown, but it's got an estimated 1.6 billion euros of gross win, so player spend in 2020. That's down from 2 billion in 2016. This forecast to return back to that 2 billion level in 2022. Now, what I'd say here, similar total market is actually slightly declining over this period, minus 0.2%. Retail, the land-based market, is declining much faster. So if you think back to what Europe was, the retail in Europe was minus 1% CAGR. In Finland, it's minus 6%. But the big difference is in Europe, the growth was driven by the online onshore. So operators who are locally licensed, which is growing about 21% a year in Europe, that's growing 5% a year, or at our forecast period in Finland. And actually it's the offshore market, which, although it is smaller, that's growing faster. So we call it offshore, other people may call it legal, illegal. We won't get into that debate about exactly where the player is located and the operator, but the the non-locally licensed operators are growing faster than the locally licensed onshore operators, and they're both growing a lot faster than retail, which is in decline. If you look at the next slide, we'll see the split, because obviously when we talk about the wider gambling market or gaming market, it is many different products. So there's betting, which incorporates horse and sports betting. There's lotteries, which are pretty self-explanatory, and there's gaming, which can account for gaming machines, arcades, casinos, etc. Online, you've obviously then got poker, bingo, and other products. So retail market, which is slightly small, is less than 50%, 870 million euros. Betting is a very, very small part of the retail market. Lotteries makes up just under a quarter, and almost 3/4 of that is through gaming revenues. Online, there's a bit more of an even split, but still, gaming is almost half of it. Betting, a much bigger proportion in terms of what we tend to see elsewhere, and almost a quarter of the market. And actually, lottery is much higher than you would see in other markets that probably have more developed betting and gaming markets at 28%. Now, if we look at the percentage online, actually Finland has on the next slide, Finland has a relatively high percent of gambling online, at 57% of the market. Again, we use 2022 because clearly in 2020 and 2021, the proportion of the gambling spend online is much higher, because in many countries, the land-based businesses have been closed for many months. So if you have an artificially depressed retail market, clearly the percentage will be higher. So this is why we use 2022. So it is much higher than the European average of 30%. The one thing I would say is this doesn't tell us too much about the online market, which may seem surprising, because it is really also a function of the size of the land-based market. And as an example of this, Italy has one of the most developed online markets in the world. Its online market is twice the size of the Swedish online market, but because it has such a large land-based market, its percentage online is only 17% versus 70% in Sweden. So we wanted to put this in to show the proportion online versus land-based, but it's not necessary. It doesn't tell the full picture, because on that you'd say that Sweden has a much better online market than Italy, and actually Italy's is twice the size, because it doesn't tell you about the relative size of the retail market through different reasons, be that historic or regulatory, etc. On the next slide, what we think is probably more important is to show the proportion of the market which is onshore versus offshore. Now, the first thing, and just giving factual data here without really getting too much into it, but it is agreed by, I think, anyone, investors, regulators, operators, monopolies, competitive market. A smaller offshore market is viewed as optimal, because offshore activity offers more limited consumer protection, and it generates no economic benefit to a country. And quite often we'll speak to regulators, and I'm sure the people on the panel will have an even more in-depth view on this, but we'll speak to them, and some people regulate to generate tax revenues, others will say we don't care about tax revenues. The reason we have our gambling market as our gambling market is structured is for player protection. We want to be able to control what products they're getting, what rules the operators have to follow. And that only works if the players are playing with onshore operators, because you can have the most stringent rules in play you want, but if 35% of your players are spending with offshore operators that are not under the control of your regulator, then there is no protection. Your rules do not apply to those players. So onshore activity, or what we call online channeling for onshore versus offshore, is viewed as a key factor in the gambling industry, for regulators and for ourselves. So if we look at what's happening in Finland, it's changed a bit during this downturn, so during the COVID, and even before that it did start to drop off, with more activity going offshore. So that's the top one, and we're now around 35% of gambling spend is estimated to be generated through offshore operators who are licensed outside of Finland, rather than through Finnish licensed operator. And then we've just broken down how much of this is through betting, gaming, and lottery for the onshore. If we compare this to other countries across Europe and for Europe as a whole on the next slide, we'll see that for Europe as a whole, 75% of online gambling spend is done through locally licensed onshore operators, which is higher than in Finland. You have the UK up at 98%, Italy, where I was showing you, actually has a very low online penetration at 17%. They have a very good online model. They have a very developed, lots of products, and they've been around for a long time. They have 95% of all their online gambling activity takes place onshore. See Denmark, Sweden up there. On the flip side, you have Norway, which has a more monopolistic model. They have a much lower, and 50% of theirs is through onshore, locally licensed operators. And Poland, France are there around the middle. Poland, which has part of its online market, which is commercial, and part of it, which is monopolistic. And there's some discrepancies there. And France, which has limited products. So again, they don't allow online casino, for instance. So really the availability of products does, and the competitive nature of the markets does have is highly correlated to the portion of revenues which are generated through onshore versus offshore operators. Next slide, I just wanted to use Poland as a quick example, because some people say, well, you know, I've heard an argument that if we have the same regulations as another country, our onshore channeling would be different for various reasons, be it cultural, behavioural differences, how long they've been open, etc. You can't compare apples with apples because every country across Europe is slightly different in many respects. Well, Poland, they have a commercial online betting market. So they have operators open to multiple licenses. And they have a very high percent, or relatively high percent of online betting. It would be higher, but they do have a very, very high tax rate. So there's only a certain number of operators who are in the market, but relatively speaking, they have over 90% of online betting revenues are generated through onshore operators. The exact same players. For the gaming side of things, that is run through a monopoly, and with very stringent restrictions where they are not allowed to advertise the monopoly. And this gets to the point where actually a lot of surveys have done, a lot of players don't know who is actually onshore or offshore, but half the revenues for online gaming in Poland are generated through offshore operators. So this shows that with exactly the same culture, same customers, same people, same everything, they have looked at the online betting and online gaming market, and they've run one as a competitive market, one as monopoly, admittedly with very restrictive advertising. And you have seen significant differences in terms of the proportion of revenues which are generated onshore versus offshore across those two products. Final slide, and this is one I'll try and explain, make it a bit more complicated than it probably is. I'll try and explain this in as simple way as possible. So the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the onshore channeling, so the proportion of revenues that are generated through onshore operators. And the x-axis going across is the tax rate. Now the two lines, one being monopoly operator, one being competitive market, are sloped down, top left to bottom right, which is pretty self-explanatory that the lower the tax rate, the more likely you are going to be having more people play onshore with your operators. Three reasons, many reasons. One, if you've got a low tax rate, more operators will automatically come onshore. They'll be able to spend more money on marketing because they don't have as much coming out as tax, and they will be able to offer competitive pricings on products. So the offshore market doesn't have an advantage. If you have a very high tax rate, then first of all, fewer operators would want to come onshore and pay that tax. It doesn't become particularly viable. If they do, they're not able to spend as much on advertising because of their increased cost base on tax. And finally, they may have to increase their pricing. So if you have a high tax on turnover, you're going to have to do very uncompetitive pricing on your sports betting. So for a customer, you have a choice of using an onshore operator that is really uncompetitive, expensive, or an offshore operator. Now, the reason we've split this between the monopoly and the competitive, which hopefully will enable the discussion they are having, a monopoly is able to absorb higher taxes. than a competitive market model because they have lower costs. They don't have the same marketing costs. They're not in a competitive environment. So you can charge a higher tax rate to a monopoly than you could in a competitive market because of the cost base. However, at any given tax rate, a competitive market will have a higher proportion of revenues generated onshore than offshore. So really, it comes down to a bit of a compromise between tax rate and tax generation and consumer protection. Because at any given tax rate, you'll have more people onshore protected with a competitive market, but you will be able to have a higher tax rate with a monopoly due to the different cost structure.
I think that was the end of. There's Ed. Oh, we lost you for a second there, Ed. But I think we heard everything. Is that have we reached the conclusion?
We've reached conclusion. I'll just say that you'll have more onshore at any given tax rate for a competitive market, but under a monopolistic model, you can have a higher tax rate than you could with a competitive market, and there's that trade-off between the two.
Excellent.
But thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. So I should say that the Ed slides here and indeed the whole panel itself will be available afterwards for people to download if they wish. Also, in terms of questions, you will hopefully be able to see on your screen a little panel with the word questions. You may need to click it to drop it down, and in there you can type in a question that you have, and that will come through to me. We're going to reserve questions for both Ed and the rest of the panel for some time towards the end, but please do start sending them in now if you have them, and indeed throughout the whole conversation, if something occurs to you that you want to ask, pop it in there, and I'll do my best to get it answered before the end. So, discussion time, Finland. To set the scene, Jari, I'm hoping you can help us here, both as a Finn and someone with experience from within Veikkaus. Could you set the scene for what's going on in Finland at the moment as briefly as is possible in terms of the debate around gambling? Yeah, just to start there.
Yeah, how many hours I have time? So
you have 2 minutes.
I will spend just a short time about the history, how we have come where we are at the moment. So until 2016, we used to have 3 separate gambling operators. Veikkaus took care of lottery and sports betting issues, Ray, casino operator, and then Fintoto took care of horse betting. But then we had some legal challenges and business challenges, so Finnish state decided to merge those 3 operators, and from the beginning of 2017, we have had just 1 monopoly gambling operator, also called Veikkaus. And what happened, what has happened, as we noticed from Ed's slides, for some reason, the revenue has decreased year after year when we have had just 1 monopoly operator. And why that has happened? Actually, the main reason has been 2 different expectations from state, Finnish state, the owner of the company. At the same time, they have been looking for more revenues from Veikkaus, but also less gambling problems. And it hasn't been clear enough for Veikkaus and Veikkaus management what they should do. So unclear expectations, that's my own opinion as a former director from Veikkaus, that has caused some challenges. And what has happened now, not only during the COVID time, but also before that, and despite of that, we have had now more discussion about Finnish gambling policy than ever before, and not only positive discussion. So it has mainly concentrated on a number of gambling problems, which have actually, by the way, stayed at the same level all the time. So we have had about 3% of adults who have suffered somehow gambling problems, and it hasn't changed, although the volume of gambling has something like tripled during this century. So it's strange. It's the core curve of gambling problems is like a dead man's heart rate. So it hasn't changed at all despite of the volume. But what is going on now? Finnish government established the working group 1.5 years ago, a little bit more than 1.5 years ago, and that working group prepared a new proposal of Lottery Act, our gambling law. And we got that the proposal at the end of last year, and then get the views from beneficiaries, ministries, different bodies there, and then the government finalized, Minister of Interior Affairs finalized that proposal, drafted law, and sent it to European Union notification process in April this year. And now we are expected to get that back from notification process. And as far as I have understood, is that it will be almost the same. And it's supposed to go to our parliament in the next few weeks. So let's see what will happen, but we will continue as a monopoly country. The working group even, they didn't consider other possibilities, so no analysis of a license-based market at all. So it seems to me that first they make decision, the politicians make decision that we will continue as a monopoly country, and then working group just found out their explanations and reasons why we should do that. So that's
so it's fair to say that the idea of a monopoly, of shifting the system away from monopoly, is not really on the table right now.
Actually, we have now more and more public debate on that, but nothing more. So no real actions in that area yet.
So maybe not on the political agenda yet, but it is happening in public, which sometimes.
Yes, and also some politicians have now changed their opinion. But as an old odds complier, I would say that the odds is 1.1 that we will continue as a monopoly-based gambling law from beginning of next year. It won't change now, but I'm quite sure that discussion will continue, and let's see what will happen in the future. But it will take at least some years until we will seriously consider to have a license-based system.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting context. So thank you, Birgitte. I wonder if you can come in then, and you obviously been through the process of shifting legislation. Perhaps you can tell us share some of the good and the bad. If Finland was to consider this path, what would be the things you would point out to them?
Right. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. And thank you very much for excellent info from both Ed and Jari. So I'm a little bit shocked still about all the stuff I just heard. but just to take you back, so I was regulating together with a great team the Danish market for 12 years. And so we changed the whole profile of the Danish system back in 12. So from 12 and onwards, we've been dealing with both online licensing and online licensing system. We have for many years had a liberalized slot machine market. For many years on land-based casinos also, and churches as well is still there with their old legislation going on. And still we do have a piece of monopoly going on. We still have our lotteries, the typical lotteries in a monopoly system. And we have the monopoly company still going strong, I would argue, doing online, but now in a separate company, competing with all other operators in the online market. So that has been going on in Denmark for many years. And we saw a political will and support to change things back in 10. So I would argue it is, of course, a significant difference from the situation in Finland that we have really great many parties supporting this, and we felt support throughout many of the years regulating after that. And so that is part of the successful results in Denmark. And when I say successful, I very much look into the channeling. So the channeling were back then, and still is quite fine. And with that, I am very happy to say, when you have a higher channeling rate, as we were just perfectly explained, it means that you take good care of players. So they play in a safe environment, being regulated and at all times looked at to be safe and proper. So all in all, very good experiences in Denmark. But at the same time, I'm not arguing that what happens in Denmark and works for Denmark would work for Finland.
Okay, well, we'll definitely talk more about that shortly. Rolf, I want to ask you about, I mean, Kindred, your employer, obviously would, they've stated anyway, they would prefer to be licensed in the market. I mean, what kind of model from your perspective are you thinking that the Finnish should move to?
Well, first, thank you very much, Joe. Thanks to the EGBA for inviting me to be on the panel. I mean, I think the fundamental problem with Finland today is there's a lack of acknowledgement of the modern day technology and consumer behavior on the internet. I mean, Finland has a gambling monopoly. It's been an integral part of Finnish society for many years, contributed to good causes, and perhaps it's worked, but now things have changed. More people are going online. We have a new generation of gambling online. The modern day consumer is empowered with the freedom of choice, and I think you have to reflect that in legislation. And Kindred as a company, we do have Finnish customers, and we feel it's a natural thing. We want to have licenses where we do have our customers. And we advocate for a licensing system in Finland, emulating the Danish and Swedish model, to be quite frank. What sort of model are we looking at? I think there are several myths about the international gambling industry. One of them is that we don't want to be regulated. We don't want to pay tax. That's not true. We do want this. I mean, my company and a lot of other European companies, we have licenses in many European jurisdictions. We're licensed in America, we're licensed in Australia, and we comply and we pay tax. And we want to do that in Finland as well. Another myth is also that with a licensing system will entail a mass liberalization of the market in Finland. We aren't talking about a liberalization, we're talking about a re-regulation to address a new reality and a pragmatic approach to where people are playing with regard to consumer protection and also to tax revenues. And the model we're looking at is basically a model where you license online sports betting and casinos. I mean, there's a myth going around that this will break an entire monopoly. That won't happen. I mean, like in Denmark and Sweden, Danske Spil and Svenska Spil, they've kept the national lottery, the slot machines and the scratch tickets, but have gone into the online sector with a subsidiary competing on the equal level with us. And that's the model we're looking at in Finland as well. And Veikkaus would probably have Finnish law allows it. That's a political decision to go and establish a subsidiary. But the old Veikkaus with the monopoly will still continue with the slot machines and national lottery and everything.
Yes, Jari.
May I give a few comments on that, and also those slides what Ed showed us. So channelization rate is extremely important. So here in Finland, we have I could tell you 4 different numbers. So totally, Veikkaus still has something like 73% of market share. In digital sales, they have 60%. But if we take just online casino games and fixed odds sports betting, their Veikkaus market share is just something like 35%. Or if we take just fixed odds sports betting, it's just less than 25%. So it's a really strange situation when we have a monopoly system here, and monopoly operator has 1/4 of sports betting business. So how long we could continue there? It should be also interest of Finnish regulator and Finnish state to regulate as much gambling as possible what happens here in Finland. And now the new proposed Lottery Act, the idea there is try to prevent gambling of a pro, not let national monopoly operator to have opportunity to develop something new. And our customers are not stupid; they are wise enough to understand that that's not modern way to act.
Yeah, I'm interested. Oh, Geeta, yeah, go for it.
Perhaps I could also comment on that, just being said from Jari. I have not seen around the globe really that much harm being done to former monopoly companies when it comes to online competition. So I would argue any time that on the contrary, I think former monopolies that used to do online just as the sole operator in the market, they normally pick up the challenge in quite a successful way and do their thing still, but with competition around, they might even get better at what they do. So to me, it's a win with more win on top. When you look at developments around the world, and indeed in Europe on its own, look around, and I would argue, and it is of course a cheap one, but I would still argue there would be great many EU member countries here making great mistakes if they are all wrong in liberalizing their gambling market. I mean, when you look at the results, they are facing typically a higher channeling, better protection for customers. And I would also agree with Wolf saying, to my best experience throughout 12 years, I really did experience that obviously those that approached us in Denmark really were keen to have a legal opportunity. They were looking to be compliant if they could just be told what to do. And we're looking for actually just have some legislation and regulation in place so they could actually get into a market in a very good way. So those good guys, as I love to call them, would actually argue any time that they do not want to actually produce harm to anyone if they can avoid it. Obviously, it sounds very sweet, but I would still argue that it's on the shoulders of any government to take good care of citizens. And I've not seen an example where you do that much better, at least in Europe, than in actually dealing with all the different products coming into the market, being bought by players, but with no protection. I think governments need to deal with the fact that they have citizens gambling, minors, all sorts of people that might not know what they're getting themselves into, losing great amount of money and making damage also to those dear ones around them. So I think it's a huge issue if you have a low channeling at the end of the day. And I would not advocate for just a Danish model, but I would advocate for looking out in the world, as Jerry mentioned, sort of in a way. There's so much to pick and choose from and make your own model.
I think it's very important. I mean, channelization is not just about money or tax revenues. It's about protecting players, basically. I mean, we have this new generation going online. People are now gambling online. Problem gambling is always going to exist as long as you have gambling. And as long as the intent is going to move that way. So we have to sort of fence this in somehow through regulation. The whole point of channeling is that regulation, national law, encompasses all the gaming offers which citizens in the countries are playing on. And Sweden, I mean, I think a good example of Sweden is they've introduced something called spelpåse, which is it was a gaming stop, which applies to all the licensed companies on the market. That if you have a problem gambling, if you're a problem gambler, you can basically exclude yourself from all licensed companies. And that's a good example of a licensing system, how you can protect players when it comes to problem gambling.
We've had very interesting question come in. I will reassure viewers, I'm not generally going to read out who asked the question, so feel free to submit anonymously. But this one, it doesn't make sense unless I say that it's come from someone at Gamban, which is a piece of software that you can use on your phone to restrict, block basically your access to gambling websites. It's a service for for those suffering from gambling harm. And interestingly, he says that Finland is the second highest after the UK user base that they have, the number of people coming to their website, which is very interesting. But interesting point, and also has an interesting question, maybe one for Jari to take. There is an alternative approach, which is, I know, been floated in Finland, which is instead of opening up the market to other operators in order to increase the channelization rate, you instead introduce measures to protect the monopoly, for example, payment blocking. Could you talk a little bit about that being on the table and give your view on what you think of it?
Yeah, so it's there in draft law that we will have payment blocking from the beginning of next year, or in practice a little bit later, but it's there in proposed law. And the idea behind that is that offshore operators who target marketing or have marketing actions here in Finland will be blacklisted by the regulator. And then when a company will be blacklisted, then banks and payment providers should block payment to and from that company. That's the idea. So it's almost the same what Norway is doing. But when we are looking, when we look results from Norway, what has happened there? When they introduced tighter payment blocking system there, it decreased offshore gambling quite a lot for a while, but it took less than 1 year and it was up what it was before that tighter payment blocking. So there are all the time new technology, new way to take care of payments, whatever. So customers are used to them. So it's not a workable, a very practical way to try to prevent something. So as I already mentioned, I rather would like to see new tools for monopoly operator to offer as good products and services as possible, instead of try to block the other operators away from the market.
And perhaps I could also comment on that. So in Denmark, we made use, and still do make use of IP blocking. We did have the opportunity to also implement payment blocking, but we didn't find actually having to do that, simply because we got that many licensed operators to the market. So there was no need to actually do that much to keep out anyone else from the market. In the sense that, to me, it seems to be much more straightforward to make sure that you have legal offerings in a market in a way where there's simply no room left for anyone else wanting to be in there offering products without paying what they ought to pay to the jurisdiction, right? So really, it's a much stronger tool to have a licensing system in many ways than trying to block. I would argue, even though it might turn out to be quite effective, I would still argue you can't stop water from running. And I mean, players themselves nowadays are getting extremely knowledgeable about how to circumvent and how to find what they want to do. So they know where they want to play, and they've been doing that for years already, right? So they will know where to go. And I think that's extremely worrying if we have too many players out there without any kind of focus or protection from government.
Yes, no, I agree totally with Birgitte what you say. I mean, sustainable good regulation is based on good parameters and stipulations for a market. When it comes to payment blocking, I just got to comment that it's a very, very strange construction, because we have payment blocking in Norway. We've had it since 2011, and it raised all these issues. Should the banks actually be given a policing role in the gaming area? According to Norwegian law, the banks are obliged to not undertake transactions, but now they can't actually undertake and stop the cash flow. So now they're actually threatening the customers to close their bank accounts and closing the customer agreements, which is a very disturbing development, I think. when it comes to personal freedom, because in Norway it's not illegal to gamble online. And at the same time, we have the authorities and the banks are doing everything to prevent you and actually moving on to your customer relationship as a consumer. And also payment blocking, like Yardi said. I mean, since 2011, turnover in the Norwegian market to offshore companies has risen. I mean, problem gambling we've witnessed a substantial rise in problem gambling from 2015 to 2019. So, I mean, it boils down to a philosophical approach. How do you regulate a market? Do you use a monopoly with all these restrictions and enforcement powers and build up this huge system of surveillance, which you end up in a cat and mouse game that doesn't work? Or do you take a step back and think, let's think differently, let's regulate, talk to the industry, make things open and transparent, and work to prevent players and secure tax revenues?
And I would like to comment as well, saying, well, just to be the devil, the lawyer here, saying, well, looking just on a fresh slate, saying, okay, if you want to go down that street saying we put it all on the shoulders of one state-owned company, still one company have to deal with all the different variations of gambling, right? So that is a significantly pressure because things are developing in at such a rapid speed nowadays. So expecting one state-owned, and excuse me, but state-owned company would have to compete with the biggest companies of the world out there to figure out how to offer the absolutely most attractive products to their players, right, in Finland. And I'm just saying, to me, it seems to be an extremely huge task to do that, just as successful as the many operators that would have loved to actually be licensed in Finland, I imagine. I think it's a very huge, high expectation to have to any state-owned company, really, to compete with the free operators of the world, so to speak, that they can actually believe that they can follow to produce the same kind of offerings and protect the consumers just as well. I'm just very curious to see how that is expected to be done. And I heard it being said early on that Vikhaus has also been looking out, saying, what do you expect from us? And I'm just saying, if this is the expectation of a state-owned company, that they should sort of compete with everyone out there and get the channeling up at 90%, I can't really see how that should happen within a reasonable scale of time anyway, before you see more sad stories about harm being done to people.
Yeah, but now it's quite clear that the main expectation from the Finnish state is just to reduce number of gambling problems. So that conflict between higher revenue and less gambling problems has now partly went away. So at least officially, they don't care so much anymore about the profit from Veikkaus. But what it will mean that the service level, what the Finnish customers will get from a monopoly operator, will go down, at least compared to offshore operators. And you should remember that also in the future, according to new proposed law, gambling to offshore operators is legal here in Finland. Me as a customer, I don't break any law when I gamble to Rolf's company. So I can see what the other operators are offering, and I'm afraid when the Veikkaus offering won't develop anymore as it used to develop in the past years. So the what you call the customers are not anymore behalf of on the monopoly system. I'm sure about that. That will change very rapidly if the monopoly operator can't compete against the other operators.
I'm interested, someone submitted this question, and it was also a question I'd written down, so it's a doubly good one to ask. I think, Jari, you're the best place to ask this. Is there any mistrust publicly in Veikkaus? You said there's a kind of intense public debate, but is that in any way translatable into public pressure for a change in the system? Because as we know, ultimately these are decisions made by politicians, and they're often influenced quite heavily by public opinion.
Yeah, so although we have now public debate in lots of news or stories in the media, still it's just we are at the beginning of a serious discussion. So we have now some politicians who have publicly announced that probably license-based system might be better. But I think that we are quite far away from serious discussion and planning. So as I already mentioned, it will take a few years. And at the same time, I should mention that actually, as a former Veikkaus director, I would say that there is no fault in the company. Veikkaus at itself, they have a really difficult position between different kind of expectations from state. So now the debate is mainly about the gambling system and what kind of system we should have, not only monopoly versus license-based system, but profit for the beneficiaries versus number of gambling problems. How to solve that system? So and then of course the role of beneficiaries, how important that they have used to get their money directly from Veikkaus revenue, and now it seems that the Finnish state will change that system from the beginning of 24, and that will change the political opinions for sure, because those beneficiaries have been the strongest lobbying organization on behalf of Veikkaus for years. And when they don't have any more direct link between their revenues and Veikkaus monopoly position, so there won't be any more need to support Veikkaus. So let's see how that will change the political climate, but it will take a few years.
So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Birgitte.
So Jari, so you're saying, and obviously, you know, I don't know Veikkaus as a company, so I have no finger on that. It's just, I'm just saying it's a huge pressure to put on a state-owned company to have that kind of expectations that they can deal with all kind of gambling at all times and create an attractive market for all the different products. But getting back to your latest comments, so Veikkaus is actually facing a lower earning, right, for the years to come. And in that sense, I see a very bad circle in the sense that they will create less earnings, they will have less resources to keep up with all the new developments in the world and to create attractive products, and indeed make use of some of the latest tools also when it comes to protecting players. I mean, artificial intelligence is one of the really attractive tools when it comes to protect players. I mean, Mindway artificial intelligence tool is one of them, where you actually make a mix of big data handling combined with human experts, finding out which of your customers are actually at a risk of developing problem gambling. And I would argue that takes some resources inside and so forth to make use of that kind of tool. So I would just be slightly worried if any company standing with all of this on their own would be capable facing at the same time a less good earning. So I think it's a challenge for Finland and for the players in Finland.
We're coming close to the end now, and there's still quite a few questions. So apologies, we won't be able to get to all of them, but thank you very much for sending so many in. It's very much appreciated. Someone's asked a very big question, which I'm going to turn into a very small one. I think for Birgitte, that someone's asked which European model would be the best fit for Finland? Obviously, a very big question. But if you had to pick from your experience, both in Denmark and I know you're well traveled and familiar with different European models. I mean, what one thing would you suggest that Finland ought to consider as a major positive if they were coming up with gambling regulations that were more open?
Well, I'm afraid I will sound like a politician now in the sense that I would say Finland is unique, like all of the countries in Europe, really. And that's why we love to go to Finland, right? To see the Finnish way of doing things. So Finland would have to pick and choose the best of everyone and to evaluate whether that combination of the best would be perfect for Finland. So the best news really for Finland would be, in my view, that we've had 10 years plus to gain experience with do's and don'ts. And by now, you have the absolutely best platform to go out there and explore and put together your own perfect model for Finland. So I would look to those countries that have been successful with channeling rates and using less time on policing and much more time on attracting the good guys and taking care of players. And there are a number of jurisdictions in Europe that has done a really great job in exactly that.
Can you name any of those jurisdictions?
Well, you know, just to pick a few, but we saw the slide. It speaks for itself, really, from Ed, pointing out the UK, Denmark, Sweden, but there are a lot of countries out there. The Italian, the Spanish market changed their tax rate, took it down, and that certainly changed into a better position. So really, there's a lot of experience out there. So I wouldn't really point at only one jurisdiction. There are many.
Yeah. Well answered. Good. Well politically answered. Thank you very much, Birgitte.
Sorry.
No, it's very good. Rolf, kind of the reverse question for you. I mean, imagining a scenario where Finland does re-regulate, but we end up more in a situation, say, like Germany. Is that still something that Kindred would be pushing for?
Well, that's a very hypothetical question, Joe. I mean, it's impossible to answer that basically. So, I mean, but of course, I mean, I would have to say that Finland, I mean, it depends on the regulation at the end of the day. And we hope we don't end up with a German regulation. But I mean, I think I would have to say Finland was actually in the forefront of iGaming. I mean, Veikkaus was the first national gaming company that was allowed to go online in 1997. And Finland was actually, the government was at a very early stage acknowledged online gambling as a medium for online gambling and allowed Veikkaus to go online. 24 years down the road, a lot has happened. The world has changed, and I think the Finnish government should take a step back and now have a unique opportunity for a new approach. And I would also encourage and invite the government also to talk to the industry, so to learn about how online gambling actually functions, how it works, how the consumers behave, how we as companies operate, also with regard to responsible gambling. And I think it's also important for us as an industry to behave as a very serious and sincere sparring and talking partner to Finnish authorities if they want to. I mean, as you say, Birgitte, Finland is unique. I said, okay, let's emulate Sweden and Denmark. Those are quite true. That are good models for an outset, but Finland is a unique country. And I think it's important for us as an industry to sort of to learn and understand about how Finnish society functions and the special aspects which will have to be reflected in legislation. So I hope through such a process, engagement with us as the industry, also with other countries, as Birgitte mentions, I think Finland could come up with a good regulation that everybody can live with and can be successful.
All right. Well, closing question then, and this is coming from the audience, so again, I'm going to adapt it slightly. Someone's asked, Jari, what do you think the Finnish gambling market will look like a year from now? I think you probably told us a year from now it may not look substantially different, but what about 2 years from now? I mean, if they are to follow a path towards a more liberal situation, what sort of timeline is realistic, do you think?
Yeah, we will have parliament election in spring 2023, and I believe that the new government, whatever it will be, we have now so-called left-wing government. If it will be right-wing, I'm quite sure that they will make decision about the new kind of gambling legislation during their period there. So my estimation is that Finland will decide to change the legislation in 2024, and then it will take 1 to 2 years to change it. So that's my guess. That,
I admire your prediction.
yeah, and as I already mentioned, I'm a former Otscom player, so all days.
So we should trust you, is what you're saying.
So that's my line. Beginning of 26, we will have a license-based system.
Well, very interesting. We'll have to hold this panel again in the beginning of 2026 and talk about what's actually happened. Thank you all very, very much. I think we could have spoken about this for ages and ages, and we had lots of questions didn't get to. Apologies, but I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.